T minus 30 seconds. T minus 20 seconds. Ten, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Fuck you, Westport! Can't let smoke go into weed. Can't let smoke go into weed.
Hey everybody, Chad Westport here, and we are back with another installment of Cannabis in Your Body with Dr. Miyabe Shields. And you know what? I'm going to take a guess and say you're having a great day. Is that true?
I've been having a good one so far, and
That's
I'm going to take a
awesome.
guess and say you've been having a great day.
My day is wonderful because we have been talking about some very important things, and I appreciate your time and the conversation. So thank you again for being here for the series.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I love the interface of all the questions that don't have answers, but I hope I give the best. There's no answer for that possible.
You know what? You do a good job. You give me more fuel to research because again, these questions are just coming from my natural curiosity, and I appreciate your dedication to the art of science here. So let's get into it today, because this is common. Again, I'm so selfish here. This is all about me here. So my body, for some reason, it's in conflict with the science, but for some reason, what I am told, what is widely known, is that consumers develop a tolerance to THC over time, which would require higher doses. Now, does that mean, higher doses to reach the same effects? That's, I guess, how tolerance works.
Yeah.
But does that
in theory, if you can ever reach the same effects again, that's a whole nother thing.
The high school high, right? We all know about the high school high.
Yep.
Good point. Gosh, so smart. Okay. But what does that mean though? Like, does your ECS actually shed the cannabinoids faster? Because it's like, hey, this used to get you to, a certain place, but now it's this. So what happens to all of that?
So there are a couple of different mechanisms for tolerance, just generally. But what is usually attributed to cannabis or to THC tolerance is a downregulation or a decrease in the number of CB1 receptors. Is that if you use cannabis a lot, you're going to actually recycle and have less of those CB1 receptors. Now, then the reason why you would need more cannabis is that if there are less receptors, you need more cannabis so that those ones that are present are activated more often. Because like I mentioned in one of the previous things segments we were talking on, it's not like we inhale these molecules and they just beeline. They don't have a secret honing thing. They're just kind of wafting around and then they interact with the receptor, right? Now imagine if you had hundreds of CB1 receptors, the molecule that's floating around is going to interact with one because there's more of them. If you decrease the number of receptors that are there, it's going to take more THC molecules to be able to interact with the same number of receptors, because it's all about reaching a threshold here. There's been some studies that show, I think it might be in animal models, that if you quit cold turkey, it takes 2 weeks. And I think that might be where the 2-week number came from, or maybe it just came from community evidence of people taking breaks for about 2 weeks, because I think that's probably the standard. Usually I hear somewhere between 2 to 4 weeks of being cold turkey, although I don't advise that personally. And I don't take tea breaks ever.
Mm-hmm.
I think that they're necessary if you develop crazy tolerance but it's kind of, in my opinion, better to just, either decrease your tolerance more slowly, something called tapering, which, would mean that you're going to have to be conscious of how much you're using in the first place, which is usually somewhere to start. But It is, I mean, I think it's pretty well understood that if we are consuming regularly, our bodies do get used to a certain amount. And especially if we're going for a specific effect that happens at higher doses, and I'm talking about like chronic pain patients, chemotherapy patients that are using it for anti-nausea effects, people who really require very high doses of cannabinoids, you do develop a tolerance in that, you can take more and feel subjectively less.
Okay. And explained, that makes sense to me. Again, you need more of the THC molecules because there's less receptors, and not because there's more, not all of them are going to find a home. There are only a certain number that's going to find a home, and that may be the approach.
Right. And then it's like if you imagine like every time a THC receptor or a THC and a CB1 receptor meet, if you imagine it as like that contributes 5 marbles to a jar or something, and you need to fill the jar to have an effect,
Okay.
right? If you had 100 receptors and 100 THC molecules, you'd get 100 marbles and you'd fill the jar, right? Now, all of a sudden, if you have 50 CB1 receptors, they're going to need 2 marbles each before they fill the jar to 100, and then you reach the effect. And it's not really well understood, like cross tolerances, but they exist, right? I think the most commonly talked about cross tolerances in the community are actually psychedelics, like between, say, like LSD and psilocybin. A cross tolerance meaning like a tolerance in one thing leading to a tolerance in another. Because an example of that cross tolerance with cannabis is anesthetics, like surgical anesthetics, which is why if you're going to have surgery, most of the time it's beneficial to, first of all, try to decrease your tolerance if you have a tolerance. But second of all, to be honest with your anesthesiologist and tell them up front if you regularly use cannabis, because you can have a higher tolerance to their anesthetic, which means that you might not be, you might not be in the right state for your surgery, which can be very, very traumatic. So,
Yeah.
And so there are things that can contribute to tolerance outside of just cannabis and just the cannabinoids. But for the most part, I think that in terms of shedding it, or in terms of like getting rid of it, the metabolism will stay the same. Like to my knowledge, like there isn't a huge difference in the enzymes that specifically for THC and like CBD and the cannabinoids. They're kind of like the average enzymes. They're called like cytochrome P450 enzymes, and they're this huge class of enzymes that metabolizes most drugs. They metabolize most, not just drugs, but like exogenous things, like most things that come from outside our bodies. And there are things that set off the upregulation or downregulation of them. There are things that we do that will like increase the rate of them or decrease the rate of them. But to my knowledge, it isn't like that isn't the major contributing factor. The more major contributing factor is the receptors.
Okay. And that, that kind of makes me think as like a, chronic smoker, person who kind of smokes all day, their tolerance break is sleep. So if like THC was present and like bound to these receptors almost in like a constant state at a constant level, would it take smaller amounts of THC to please the ECS, or is it just still actively shedding them, even receptors, actively reducing their numbers in a constant smoker?
So this is kind of a complicated sort of like influx. And I think the easiest influx and outflux thing would be like if you imagined you had a bin and you have a hose putting water in the bin, and that's you smoking.
Okay.
You're putting the water in, and then there's like a funnel at the end and there's water going out. And that's the metabolism. Like there's a hole at the other end of the bucket, and that would be the metabolism or the things that are like being removed from the body. In terms of like, would adding more than like have a bigger effect in terms of cannabis, that's called titration also, by the way. If you like were to take the first dose of something and then while you are still feeling that dose, add more to it, that would be titrating up, increasing. So in that case, you would have added water to the bucket, and it hadn't fully emptied yet, and then you would add more. So yes, you can reach different effects by that way. I think that like many of us have experienced that where you've smoked once and then later in the day, or like, usually if you're smoking, usually the synergy has to happen within the first hour or two, or else you fully metabolized it.
Okay.
Because let's say that you smoked an hour ago and then you're like fully back to your baseline, like almost everything has been metabolized, then you're just kind of having a second dose. And the difference would be like maybe if there were any like immediate changes to your receptor levels, but I'd say it's probably more likely that the bigger changes that happen within that time frame would be something like your hormones or your endocannabinoid levels could change. But that would be different than, say, you smoked and within the same hour, there's still water in the bucket. There's still THC there. And then you smoke again, and then you do get higher, right? I think it's subjective. It depends on what you're trying to satisfy and like what is the question of satisfaction. And I think that's really important because for every one of us, it's different. Like
Right.
what is the reason or the intention behind the cannabis and how it helps you. And for some people, absolutely, like it's going to be maintaining a balance. And I know that for me, like my threshold is pretty low, but I do have this like pretty tight window where it's beneficial before on the upper end I can become unproductive or I can become anxious or
Right,
like,
right.
and so you're kind of shooting for understanding that that window for yourself personally.
Which is important. And I love that we're going to cover that here in just a second because that's important. And like you said, it is individualized. But that feeling of high you were just talking about, we kind of associate that with the endocannabinoid system. But is the feeling of like being high separate from the reported homeostasis aspect of cannabinoids and ECS? Like, just because I'm feeling it right now, be like, bro, I am so homeostasis. Or are they kind of
Oh
unrelated?
man, that should be like a shirt. Wow, just homeostatic. So
Or,
I feel like that's it's complicated. Certainly feeling high is feeling altered. Like we're
mhm.
altering our perspective, we're altering our systems with these exogenous, these molecules from outside the body. The cannabinoids come in. We definitely are in some ways adding to the homeostasis. So I think that it's complicated because for some people and in some contexts, adding those cannabinoids in would be balancing and it would be to maintain homeostasis. An example of this could be even when we're talking about tolerance and the receptor levels. There are some studies that point to like migraines, fibromyalgia, irritable bowel syndrome, and then other studies for, autism, PTSD, and alterations in your endocannabinoid signaling where you have more receptors, and that might be part
Hmm.
of this like alteration. So let's
Hmm.
say that you develop a tolerance and the receptor levels are brought back down. For me, I attribute this like when I have a low level of a tolerance, I don't dream that much. I don't have that many dreams. And I prefer that to having night terrors and not being able to sleep and jolting awake just like buckets of sweat and feeling like the grips of fear, like you're in it, because that's how it feels when you're having a night terror. Um, and I definitely attribute that effect, that night terror, to tolerance because it's not like it goes away the first time that I smoke. If I do go through a period where I don't smoke or I don't use cannabis, I think the last very significant period I've gone through was, years and years ago. And one of the things that does come back is those dreams. And I mean, I've gone to a point where I've gone like a year out. And because there is a point where there's a small amount of time where they will rebound and you're like in a withdrawal where you are like, people don't like that word in the cannabis like field, but that is what it is.
Right.
We do experience rebounding when we have tolerance, and then we stop using cannabis and our brains are going back to this like different state. But I mean, for me, it's like without a doubt. I mean, they didn't go away completely, and they completely go away and stay away when I have like a relatively low level of tolerance. Now, if that is attributed to having different levels of CB1 receptors, then it would be that, hey, this
Hmm.
is keeping them, like this is keeping you in homeostasis, right? But it's just about what do you define as that balance. And I mean, you were mentioning it being like, if you use cannabis all day and if that's the optimal, then that is homeostasis. But I'm of the point where like this is my homeostasis. Like I that just from me personally and my responding to you in a personal abstract thought of what do I define as homeostasis. For me, being balanced is being happy. It's being not stressed. It's being not inflamed. It's, you know, for me, maintaining my body's homeostasis is maintaining functionality. It's, not having a lot of chronic pain. It's not having major GI like GERD and like extreme like motility type things. Like it's having like a balance. And for me, that is being high. I mean, it's a different, I think I stopped viewing it that way a long time ago. It's not like I don't still get high, like that happens, like, obviously. I mean, maybe not obviously, but like I still use cannabis in ways that aren't at the bare minimum in my life. But I view that as medicinal in its own right because, it is a different time and place for everything, but those higher doses have after effects that contribute. And anyways, long roundabout way of saying that I don't think it's everyone's homeostasis, and it's probably not the medical definition of homeostasis, but I'd
Okay.
argue for you and me, it definitely is the same thing.
Yeah, and because that's usually how the endocannabinoid system is approached in the cannabis world these days, is as a system that can promote the homeostasis, which again, individual, to every individual. Gosh, that was intelligent. Yeah. So kind of from there, though, we're talking about the THC can move or is metabolized in an hour or two. But what is the average window for detection in like blood and urine and these types of things? And why is it so different? And again, this will be unique to each individual. You can only give kind of a time frame window, but I'll
It's
preface it for you there.
it's so hard because it also depends on the test. I mean, so now we're talking about detection of drugs, like for drug testing purposes of whether you would test positive or not, right? And
Mhm.
the reason why this is so difficult is because, first of all, different labs test different, like often there's like a panel of metabolites. They're not usually testing for just THC because that goes away pretty immediately. I mean, when you stop feeling high, there's not active THC in your body anymore, like for the
Hmm.
most part. Maybe there's like trace amounts there. The half life for THC in the body, I think, is only like an hour. It's pretty short, at least when it's smoked. When you have an edible,
Right.
it's, way longer. And that's a whole different thing because of the absorption and how long it takes to absorb is a contributing piece of it. But it's not long that the actual molecule THC is in your blood, and what they're looking for when you get tested is not that. They're looking for these other they're more stable metabolites. So our body in our liver will go and take the molecule and we'll add an oxygen to it, or we'll add a sugar to it. We'll like add something to it. This makes it more stable. It also, some of it we will, excrete. We will like, that's how it gets out. We pee it. But a lot of it, because of the cannabinoids being so fatty, go back and get put into our fat cells and get stored in our fat. And that's one of the reasons why it can take months to clear out of your system. And I think like it depends on your metabolism, it depends on the amount of fat that you have, and it depends on how often you use cannabis and to what amount, because the amount of it that goes into the fat is related to the amount of it that you put into your body in the first place. So and to the and like the amount of it that will get cleared out of that fat has to do with the amount of it that will that you've had like to begin with. And like, so I've known like if someone was like, I'm gonna get drug tested and I'm so scared or whatever, there's tons of like foolproof, there's all these things that people say that you do, and it's like, well, you can't dilute it too much, you can't do this too much, you
Yeah.
can't do that. In my opinion, like what I would do is I would fast so that you're running through your fat cells
Mhm.
and drinking tons of water and working out and taking all the vitamins that are like excreting. Like I know niacin is one of them. I've done that
Ooh, I've done
before.
that.
Made me itchy, made my
Yeah.
legs really itchy.
Yeah.
It's like
Oh God, yeah.
I was like, I am certainly taking too much of this niacin. Like, it's too much.
Golden seal
Um,
from back in the day, yes.
but for some people, it can last in the body for, months because you're re-releasing it. It's called the depot effect, like Home Depot, but depot meaning um instead of it being Home Depot, it's a depot for molecules. Like
Oh,
the fat acts as a depot. And then technically for hair, like there's claims that it's ridiculous long times. But also the other thing that it depends upon is like each of these testing labs has different metrics for what is and isn't, like false positive,
mm,
false negative, pot, like, and also controls on the actual test matter and all of these things. That's why I think drug testing is absolute BS. I mean, that's just like my personal, opinion on it. I think that we should get rid of it and stop
right.
doing it. And I mean, that's like a whole there. I mean, I know people being like, no, we want, how about this for cannabis? Let's like for cannabis, but it's also not fair for cannabis because many of the other drugs exit your system within 48 hours. I mean, they're just gone without a trace. And like, those are often the more harmful substances. So it's not fair. And in also many ways, it's not accurate because you can't really tell. There's to this day not like a super accurate way of telling if someone's high like right then.
No, no.
Like, and again, like I don't care if anyone goes home and has a glass of wine. Like we don't care what happens in the I do care if someone is, you know, intoxicated while doing something that is unsafe to be
Mhm.
doing that. Like that, that makes perfect sense. But we just don't have the capabilities of testing for that for cannabis. I mean, you could smoke or have an edible on a Friday night, Saturday night, and you're likely going to test positive on Monday. Like,
That's the thing that I wanted to get to here because first it sounds like they're not even testing for THC. It's a metabolite with something added on, so it's not technically THC when they said you failed for it.
I
But
know, but we wouldn't have those molecules in our body without the THC. So it's like they
no,
know that that's where it comes from. That's the other thing too, that we don't actually have a good like handle on differences in these rates based on like genetics. I mean, there's so much that we don't know that make testing discriminatory,
hmm,
like, or highly likely to be discriminatory since we're all so different. And I have, been extremely fortunate in my life to have never had a negative like situation arise from that. But I know so many people in my life with and the just the stress and everything that comes with it when this is a medicine that's just as valid. Like they would never it would just never be a thing and you couldn't even test for a pharmaceutical. It's against the law.
yeah,
Like, and
yeah,
at least for everyone who does have medical prescriptions, it should be protected in that, in that way. And then if that were the case and if it were protected, then maybe we would value the medical system more. And then maybe, there's all these,
right.
continued caveats for not treating something the same with the same respect that we treat other molecules.
I guess that kind of brings us to one of the last questions, which still can consume a bit of time here. How does a person find their therapeutic minimum or the right dosage for, the right time of day to remain productive and focused? Again, like somebody who has, maybe hard time focusing a toke or two, they may be more focused. So, but that's not, again, that's not being high. So how does a person kind of maybe go about finding that threshold or the overall effects?
So this is definitely personal experimentation. Like there's starting points for a lot of things, right? Like if people were asking about edibles and if we were asking about THC, I'd be like, why don't you start at 2 to 2.5 milligrams? That's the starting very, very low dose. If we're talking about smoking cannabis, if we're talking about flower, or if we're talking about like a concentrate, I mean, we're talking like you want to be able to, first of all, you want to be able to know how much it is. I should have started there.
Right.
It's in the beginning, it's mostly about knowing how much you are consuming and then what's called titrating. And that is starting with a really small amount, like less than you think is desirable, and then increasing it slowly and then reaching a point. So with edibles, titrating will be more difficult because they take so long to take an effect. And depending on if you've eaten or not, it can be difficult. With smoking, titrating is pretty quick and can be pretty quick and easy. So if you were curious about it and you wanted to start, you could weigh a joint. Like, let's say the joint was like a gram. You could weigh it. You could like take one hit if you wanted to. You could weigh it again and see like how much actually was that. Or you could just, hit it once and wait, 10 to 15 minutes, be like, all right, I think maybe a little more. It's also just as a PSA, it's good to experiment on yourself in a time that like isn't when you're going to have to do something productive. It's best to do like titration type stuff and self-experimentation when you have no real obligations, so that in case you do overshoot it, you could just watch TV, or you could go for a hike, or you could play some music, or you could do something else, which is a different type of productivity and just as good as many ways. But like, you could wait that 10 to 15 minutes and then see, and then write it down, right? I mean, like I honed in somewhere pretty early on it being between like, I did like 300 milligrams. That was like a third of a gram and a half a gram or something like that. Like, and of a blend of cannabinoids. And when I mean a blend, I mix with hemp flower. If you're using just THC flower, if you're familiar with hemp flower, it has different cannabinoids in it. You could experiment with those. And it's starting small, like starting lower than what you would expect, and then adding and increasing up. Now, if you overshoot it, that's okay. You write it down, and then the next time you do it, you look within that window right before and stop and be like, was that right? And the more times that you're doing that, the more times, like, especially if you're writing it down, but the more information that you have, also about strain specificity, like overall, like terp profile, like methods, like specifically with dabs, like I get a lot of energy. It has to be a little bit. It's great though, but like there's, it's different. And the more information that you have, the more of that you can kind of put together. That's how you can like discover what would be like called a therapeutic minimum, something that like maintains this level that you want with the smallest amount that you can use. And that's not to say that you have to go that little all the time, but it's more that you want to stay somewhere around there so that your tolerance doesn't get out of control and you're not just like overusing it. And then one day it comes that you really need a big effect and you can't have it because you have like a really, really big tolerance. And that, that window is going to be totally different for everyone. And I think in general, people who have chronic pain, in general tend to have high tolerances because it's a higher threshold, like of that effect, as opposed to people who use more for like anxiety or like focus, and also the sleep tolerance thing can happen pretty quickly. Depending on like form factor. And I actually developed a tolerance to edibles pretty quick. I'm not like a huge fan of the way that they feel, but they're definitely convenient for discretion. If you ever are anywhere where you can't be loud, like it's definitely useful. And I think it's all about that tracking and, finding what is going to be your way of doing it that lasts for longer than a couple weeks. Because I mean, like, you don't always, I mean, notoriously cannabis also, I'm always asked to talk about cannabis in memory and I'm always forgetting, it's like, there's definitely a link there. And so we gotta write it down and we have to be conscious about it.
Definitely write it down, be conscious, because we all think we'll remember, but no, we won't. And it's easy. You don't have to try to remember it. So having like good tools for something like this can be extremely beneficial. And I know on your website, you were talking about maybe developing something like this that people may be able to use.
Right. There is a tracker and it's on my secret studio. So for people who sign up for my email list, you could be on the secret studio and it's a moderation tracker. It's just a little tool. I'm very data oriented. So I like to look at my progress as I go along, and I created this. It's an Excel sheet and it helps you put in your own data and track. And it's a starting point. And I think it could be something that could help people stick with something for 4 weeks or maybe develop something on their own that would be helpful. So yeah, I would love to have any feedback too, if anyone's interested.
Awesome. Well, I will definitely link people to that in the show notes. And actually, I probably already just flashed it below because I'm going to add it in later. Because yeah, I've had a sneak peek of this tool, and I think it's going to be extremely valuable for a lot of people. Even, people, if you've been smoking for years and years and years, use this tool. You might learn something. So yes.
Or it might just be a fun way to represent your data. Oh, yeah. And you could grow little cannabis plants every day.
Yes, yeah, I do like that. And I'm a data nerd at heart. So yes, that's that. I love it. Oh, shoot. This has been awesome. And I'm sure this will spawn, even more questions and hopefully more sessions in the future with you. So I do appreciate your time today. Thank you very much. Also, always like to give you any last words.
No, I mean, I think we covered a lot of ground. Thanks so much for having me. And I always enjoy our conversations.
So, well, thank you very much. And everybody out there, thank you for watching and continuing to support this series. As always, questions for Dr. Miyabe Shields, put them down in the notes, and I will be sure to collect, correlate, and converse with her about them. 3 C's. Woohoo! All right, everybody, have a wonderful day. We will see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.
Fuck you, Westport!